Welcome to Harcourt Hub.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of Harcourt Hub, Harcourt House's summer podcast. I'm Claire.
And I'm Jamili. Today we are talking about Edmonton's art scene. Edmonton is known for its many small grassroots art organizations, like all the festivals we have. But within the past few months, Edmonton has seen the closure of two non-profit art organizations, the Drawing Room and Creative Practices Institute.
Today we have with us Devon Beggs and Riva Symko to talk about why this is happening, what is unique about Edmonton, and whether we should attempt to find a more sustainable structure for our art scene.
My name is Riva Symko. I am currently the writer-in-residence for Latitude 53 Artist-Run Center, which is, I understand, how I came to be talking to you today, due to a two-part article I wrote for Latitude in the last few weeks, asking, does art require 4 white walls and a concrete floor to subsist? And I'm also an arts administrator by day.
I'm Devon Beggs. I'm an artist here in Edmonton. I work for Arts Habitat as the database coordinator, and I also do outreach education for Harcourt House.
What is, in your opinion, unique about the structure of Edmonton's art scene?
I feel uniquely underqualified to answer this question because I've only been back in the city for 3 years.
Did you see any changes when you came back from before?
Well, there was more smaller organizations popping up, and they operate more as collectives, I think. And maybe that is something that I haven't seen in other cities that I've lived in necessarily, comparative cities, right? There's that book by Nancy Townsend, History of Art in Alberta, from 1905, 1970. And she makes the point that there is a lot of that grassroots motivation as kind of a tradition in Alberta.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, even Harcourt House is a good example of that. I mean, it is an artist-run center and is like established now, but it's been around for a long time. Latitude 53 as well, I think, is the oldest artist-run center in Canada, which I think really speaks to like Edmonton and everyone's attitude here going back to the 70s. I lived away for a while as well. I was living in Montreal from 2008 to 2011. And I noticed a big change when I came back as well, with more things popping up, smaller groups banding together, and shows in more sort of alternative spaces, things outside, alleyways. I missed a lot when I was gone, but I heard about it and I was keeping track. And then, and now things are sort of closing down. But I think these things just go in waves.
I think it has a lot to do with the economy too,
For sure. And the cycle of gentrification, which is a big issue. And I know for us at the Drawing Room, we sort of struggled with that because when we first got in there, it was really cheap and there's not really a lot on that block at all. A lot of empty spaces or sort of dilapidated kind of spaces, and now they wanted to raise the rent triple to what we were paying, even though our building didn't have heating even in the winter. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what ends up going in there and how that street's going to change.
I mean, that's part of the city's plan to redevelop, right?
Yeah.
Which that's something I noticed enormously when I moved back, is that the city itself physically is very different from when I left 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Over 10 years ago.
So what's the significance of having so many small grassroots organizations?
I think it just shows that people here are not afraid to take risks and start things up themselves. I think it also speaks to people being maybe unhappy with the status quo of certain big arts organizations in the city, and not wanting to be involved with them or having bad experiences with them and saying like, well, we can just do this ourselves.
And also wanting to have a particular voice in that.
Sure.
In the community, right? Like, Drawing Room had, a specific vision that they wanted, reason why you were opening, right? It's the same with Creative Practice Institute, that was significant and, that was different than what was already in existence too.
Yeah.
So that's a benefit too, because then there's multiple voices in a situation too, right?
And it's filling those gaps that are there that maybe places don't realize are even there. Like studio spaces, for example. Like once you're done school, it's like, well, where do you get a studio? Most people hunker down in their basement or whatever, which is where I'm at currently. But that's not ideal. I technically have more space now, but I miss the community and not working in a bubble. Like I feel like I'm back in the bubble.
Yeah, losing studio space is, I think it's a different issue too than losing exhibition space necessarily, right?
For sure.
Because artists do need places to work.
Yeah.
It requires space.
A creative space too, right? Not just like in your basement.
Yeah.
Would be more.
Yeah, it needs to, you need a professional space. You need to be able to, at some point, separate your work and life, right?
For sure.
That's a conundrum with like anyone who's self-employed.
Yeah.
Too. But there's also artists require space. Generally, they're making products, sometimes on a large scale, or that requires, space where you can make a mess or be loud or whatever.
Or invite people to come.
Yeah.
Right? Like inviting, professors or other artists or curators. Like it's a little, like it's okay, but it's a little weird to invite a curator to your house if you don't know them. I guess. But inviting them to your studio seems like natural and seems okay.
Yeah, it's more of a public space.
This sort of brings us to our next question, which is how important is physical space for organizations? So you talked about studio space, but what about exhibition space?
Well, I'm of the mind that physical exhibition space, permanent physical exhibition space, is less necessary now with the ability to, or with more of an ability in the visual arts world anyways, to create things, projects that are incorporated into everyday life even, or by making things that are only temporarily existent. There's been a couple examples fairly recently in Edmonton, like the Ramble and the Bramble, for instance, which is, asking artists to respond to a specific question. But I think that artist-run centers or collectives can do the same thing.
I think as we're moving, painting has died so many times, but like in the art world, as we're moving away from things that are hanging on the wall, I think it's become more apparent that you don't need those spaces necessarily. And you can do things in like alleyways or in the parks, or they can be digital as well.
Digital is a whole other category, right? I mean, we're talking, I guess, we tend to talk about physical interactions with actual material objects or performances, but the digital distribution is a whole other form of exhibition too.
And it's a thing that's not going away for sure. But if you do make physical things, you do need a physical space to show them. But that doesn't necessarily need to be in a gallery. And I think people are maybe catching on to that a little more. But what those spaces look like, it can be really varied too. And the good thing about having a permanent space is that you have that space and you know the space and it has measurements, and artists can apply for shows there knowing like what they're getting into, whereas with other sort of transitory spaces it's a little more reactionary, which can lead to really interesting projects too.
Reactionary towards a physical
the space itself, right? And it gives it a different context too. Like I think the idea with a white wall gallery is that there isn't a context. It's just like an empty
neutral,
space.
right?
It's supposed to be neutral.
Which it isn't, but
it isn't. Yeah, definitely it isn't.
Well, we collectively perform as though it is a neutral space. We kind of all buy into the idea of maintaining the art gallery, the 4 white walls and a concrete floor, as neutral, right?
But
you ignore the history, but
it totally isn't, and it does have a history. But if you move it outside of that, you're accessing different histories, which I think is really interesting to artists right now.
I think there's also the benefit of having art in spaces outside the gallery is that it potentially is then in dialogue with people who don't go to a gallery, right? Which it should. I mean, in this country where we have, as my friend Matthew Hill says all the time, we are very poor at educating ourselves or even, children growing up. You don't get a lot of visual art education or visual art literacy. So it has to happen only, generally it happens when a person happens to go to an art gallery or when a person encounters it somehow in their everyday life, right? So, I don't know, it provides an opportunity too to educate in a way that the art gallery can't, because you do have to go to the gallery.
And you're getting different people seeing these things that wouldn't normally go to a gallery. Maybe couldn't afford to go to a gallery or don't feel comfortable in a gallery space. I think that makes a big difference too. And I think it makes a big difference when people are talking about it, if they feel comfortable being critical of something. I think it's easier to feel comfortable being critical in a non-gallery space. I think when it's in a gallery space, people are like, well, I just don't get it. But I know it's art because it's in the gallery, but like, I don't get it or whatever. They're not willing to say, well, I don't think it's art, or I don't think it's effectively communicating what it's trying to communicate. Whereas I think if you see it's like somewhere else, maybe you can ask those questions. You feel more comfortable asking those questions.
At the very least, you're going to ask, what is this doing here?
Yeah.
Right? But
Yeah.
when you see it in an art gallery, you don't ask that ever.
I think it's more engaging that way for sure, because in the gallery, the average time is, 2 seconds that people look at things? So I think it's probably higher if you see something weird on the street or in a park.
I had an art history prof this year who would always say that public space is political space. So if art is happening in the public, it's automatically politicized in some way.
I would agree with that, for sure.
Yes. Well, I would agree too. I mean, that said, a gallery site is also politicized.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
But in a very uniform way across the board, right? I mean, they have fairly uniform histories, whereas our public space is not something that we generally think of as being politicized. So putting art or some kind of intervention into it makes you consider that politics, I think. Or makes those politics visible. And
more accessible again. Because in a gallery context, there's so much philosophy and theory that goes into so much that people put in there. Whereas there's theory and philosophy with public spaces too. But I think it's a little more accessible for people to understand those ideas. And there's a lot of assumptions, I think, when you put something in a gallery space in terms of the level of knowledge of the viewer. And maybe those assumptions aren't there in a public space or an alternative space.
I think it's easier to see the relevance of something when it's outside of the gallery context. When it's inside the gallery context, you're always blocked by the fact that its relevance is just because it's in the gallery. Therefore, it's institutionally sanctified, and that is its relevance. And it's hard to get beyond that, to ask how this functions in a larger conversation about whatever it is the artwork's about, right? Whether it's our current environmental ecology situation or feminism or colonialism or whatever it's trying to say, it's out of context inside a gallery.
Yeah. And it also, and there's such an inherent contradiction there for instance, like a work critiquing colonialism in a large institution. That doesn't really add up. It's inherently contradictory.
There's something de-radicalized about it.
which goes back to artist-run centers and collectives, where you can make those comments and it's not contradictory in the same way. Depends on the space, but potentially.
Do you think there's an issue with small organizations, like so many of them popping up with like funding being spread too thin, or maybe exhausting attendees, or do we really need all of these small organizations?
First of all, the problem is not with the number of organizations sucking up the funding. The problem is with the lack of funding to begin with, which is in Edmonton and Alberta really terrible. That's something I noticed when I moved back. Just how bad the funding is here. It's just completely unrecognized. And now, I'm sorry to say it, guys, but with an NDP government, it's cut even more.
And I think part of it is the distribution too. Like, I don't think it's necessarily spread thin. I think it's spread to one side more than the other.
Where's that?
Don't want to say. Don't want to get in trouble. Larger institutions, yeah.
And in Edmonton, the AGA also has, this brand new facility that's being paid off too, right? So the city does have obligations to help pay for that. They did agree to it, right?
Yeah.
That does take up a lot of funding as well.
Yeah, the funding thing is always an issue. And I think will always be an issue. I know other countries do it a little differently than we do here. I'm interested to see how we might shift out of necessity to, I hate to say it, but more sort of corporate sort of sponsorships for smaller spaces. I don't know how that'll look, but I know that's how it works in other places. In terms of fatigue, I don't think there is fatigue, because I think like what you were saying, Riva, before about having different voices, I think that's really important, and I think people do pick up on that. But the main thing is to actually go to these things and support these places, because they might not last forever. They probably won't last forever. So you gotta like get in there while you can.
Although I don't think funding bodies like to judge success based on the number of attendees, right? Which is not necessarily the case. I mean, if you're working in a collective, working in a center that's doing interesting research projects based in, a visual art methodology, that doesn't necessarily attract a physical audience to a site doesn't make it irrelevant.
I totally
it's
agree.
still part of a larger intellectual conversation about something, right?
For sure. But we still have to go, like, and see these things. We have to support each other here, for sure.
Do you think it's like maybe a lack of awareness, or
Yeah.
maybe people don't value art as much, like the cost of art?
Yeah.
I know a lot of people think it should just like be free, or maybe an artist isn't a real job title.
Those are all things.
Yeah,
All
which goes into a
things.
whole other issue.
Yeah.
And it gets back to our lack of Canadian visual art literacy, right?
Yeah.
In that there is no value system. Well, there is a value system, and artists are at the bottom of it.
Yeah, like in Montreal, it was the same issue. You know, you had the same big people getting those big shows and doing fine, but everyone else is like basically screwed. and asked to do things for free. Or
Although
told,
even
like,
some of Canada's biggest artists can't maintain a
Yeah.
career as simply as an artist.
Yeah, for sure. Which is terrible. Like, it's actually terrible.
I mean, I have some theories based on
What are your theories, Riva?
why this is a problem. Well, in North America, right? I mean, it's also a capitalist problem in that the art product is the thing that's valued. So, I don't know, you make a painting and you sell it for $1,500. That's not enough to live on for the year, right? But there's no payment for the labor it took you to do the research or to do the work of the painting. Artists should be paid for the actual labor portion of what they do, not for the research, the making, the conversations, not the product.
Yeah, it's a hard one. That's such a hard one to keep track of those things and to get people to understand, like, you know, you went to school and you got 2 degrees and you did all this research and these visits, and you traveled to like look at art and which is research, but people don't understand that's like that all goes into everything, and it's not just those like 5 or 10 or 100 hours that go into whatever you're making. It's like it's everything up to that point.
And education.
And it does go back to like how we value artists and art here, which is not very much, I guess.
In Edmonton?
Just in North America, I would say.
Without the physical gallery space, how does that change how the artist gets paid?
You know, here's the irony for me, is I think that I've been paid the best for doing shows in alternative spaces in terms of artist fees.
What do you mean by alternative space?
So,
Artist Run Center?
Okay, so one example would be I got great artist fees for showing an installation at the Jackson Power Gallery through The Works. So The Works is a festival here, but they do things outside of the festival, and one of the things is they have a partnership with an office space on the south side, and they will show works there sometimes. I don't exactly know how many times or like how they decide that. But it's an alternative space. It's in the middle of nowhere. Like, it's an industrial area. You would never just like walk by there and be like, oh, this is a gallery. Like, it's just an office building. But like, great artist fees for that. Or I was in a show at this skeezy motel on the West End. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Showtel?
Yeah.
And I got artist fees for that too. Like, I've given up on selling artwork a long time ago because I've seen people, friends and other artists, get into a cycle of essentially just making work to sell it, and that works for them, and that's fine, but I don't want to be tied to that cycle. For me, it really affects the quality of the work, and it makes me afraid to take risks.
Yeah, like you have to like commercial art to sell.
Yeah, and it's not to say that these people end up doing commercial things, but maybe they end up doing very similar things for a longer period of time, and that's not really how I operate. And I've felt pressure to do that before, and I just can't. It doesn't work for me. So artist fees are the way to go, but you need funding for that, right?
But still, you can't subsist on.
You can't subsist on
have 10
artist
shows
fees.
a year. You
Yeah.
still can't subsist on an artist
Definitely.
fees. Making artwork needs to subsist more in the way that, you know, a university professor gets paid to do research and writing and publish and teach, right?
Yeah.
And a small fraction of artists can do that, you know, teaching in university. The problem right now is that universities are becoming corporatized too, so there's less chance even for intellectuals to do that, but it should operate on a similar type of model and less on a model of selling a final product.
Yeah.
Which, having an exhibition is partially selling a final product.
For sure.
Having an artist fee is based on a final product of some kind.
Yeah, definitely. But if you have something that's not sellable, like what do you do? And there's so many artists that work in those media that you just like can't even really actually sell. Like, how do you sell like a digital video? I guess you give them the copyright to it, but like how do you, does that mean you can't show it on your website then? And they have the only copy and they're the only people that can ever show it? How does that work? Or like an installation, like how would you sell a site-specific installation to someone? Or even an institution? It happens, but it gets really complicated. We're past like the painting or the sculpture as a product. So things kind of need to shift with that too.
I mean, corporate institutions do research, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they do pay people to do that research, and there is potential for artists to work in that way too, and be paid for the work they're doing as opposed to the products, is being part of that conversation, right? Whatever it is they're researching. In terms of the direction of the corporation, it takes away a certain amount of freedom in terms of what you can research, what you're going to do, right? You don't have that same privilege of being able to do whatever you want, I guess.
Again, it's that contradiction of like how are you critical of something like the establishment or like a corporation if you're working for a corporation?
Mm-hmm. Unless that's what you're being paid by the corporation to do, right?
I can't wrap my head around that one, but yeah, that could happen for sure. But I think those artist residencies for like companies or like this, I think the city does them in like the parks department and stuff. As an artist, you're in the office and you're doing activities with the other employees that are there, and you're being paid by the city or whatever as a way to like enrich the morale or like the employees' experience of working for the company. So I guess maybe that signals a shift in how we're valuing artists, but it's still, you're being paid pennies compared to everyone else for those sorts of things too.
So when we were doing a bit of research for the topic, I came across an article about, like, it was titled, "Should we allow failing art organizations to die and just like leave the successful ones to thrive?"
So many different reasons why organizations fail.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is because they become irrelevant, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, There are a lot of irrelevant institutions that are still in operation with huge budgets. And yet, they should be dying. But if an organization is failing because their critical mandate is no longer valid, then that's a good thing. It means we've moved on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could mean that the problem's been solved.
Yeah.
But then there's other problems, such as financial management or staffing or any number of issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think probably can't be across the board determination. But most funding bodies will offer some amount of support when an organization is failing due to some sort of logistical reason.
I agree with you. I think if something is irrelevant and it's not doing well, then it's time to move on. But places can change and mandates can change and do change all the time. But it's like, how do you measure the success of a place?
Or what does it mean to be failing?
And what does it mean to fail? Like, if it's just based on finances, like, that doesn't really seem fair, because just because a place has money doesn't mean that they're doing quality programming or showing work that's interesting. All that means is that people are either going and paying to go to these places, or they're getting funding that's helping them along, I guess.
Or if a collective or a center is failing because they are working on something that they just haven't got right yet.
Yeah.
That's potentially worth allowing them to figure out, right?
Well, maybe like in terms of the drawing room.
I mean, there was a lot of factors that went into us closing down. The biggest reason was financial, but running a space like that, and I can't take credit for that, it was mostly Chelsea. She was in charge of pretty much everything, and I just helped out where I could, and I was a tenant there as well. But seeing how much work she put into it and like what we got out of it, like, it was worth it in the end. But at the same time, we were kind of both just like, let's just move on. Mm-hmm. And we lasted longer than we thought we would. So we thought of it as a win.
So you actually conceived of it from the beginning as transitory, in a way.
We never
temporary.
When we initially started, even having a gallery in there like wasn't part of the idea. It was just having a studio space.
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, why don't we have a gallery space in here? Like that means we can show whatever we want, and we can show our own work, show people that we know, bring people in from outside of the city. And then things just changed over time, and we just went with the changes. And some things worked really well and some things didn't. But for me, the measure of success was how many people came to the closing party. And the place was packed, and people were sad and didn't want to see us go. And so I felt good about that in a sad way. And it felt like we left on a high note, and we weren't just floundering at the end. We went out with a bang, for sure.
I know everyone talks about the drawing room as closing, right? But you can also think of it as this project that was never conceived of necessarily being totally sustainable.
Yeah.
But that was a momentary project, which brought these people together for common logistical reasons, but also for common ideas about art and art making.
Yeah.
And so it will persist in history.
Yeah.
But also persists now with all these people still, you and Chelsea still working on projects, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it might be under a
It's
different
evolved
name.
into more of like a partnership between the two of you, art making, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of things have evolved from our working together in the same space and developing a relationship like that. Which has been really great, and like our little bookstore is still going, just at a different space, and it's freed us up to work on our own practices more, which is good, and then to try and think of like new things we can do, and then also expand things like undercover books and sort of figure that out and what we can do. So hopefully we'll have new things on the go after the summer, but it's time for a break.
I think it gives all the people involved too this certain amount of leverage to have done that project like this that had this much visibility and impact on the community.
It's been good for all of us, and like I can just speak for myself, but it's led to so many opportunities in the city that I wouldn't have gotten without it. Yeah, and again, in that way, like it doesn't feel like a failure at all. Like it was just maybe a jumping off point, or like you said, like this thing that just happened for this period of time, and now it's gone, and that's okay.
Because the opportunity was there, the space was available.
Yeah.
So we need to stop talking about it as closing its doors. That's what you're saying. And more of as this project that existed and it doesn't exist.
I guess
the same way now.
Yeah, you're totally right. I guess I think of the drawing room as that space, though. Like I don't know if it could exist in a different space necessarily.
Still a project.
But it was a project for sure.
So would you say that having these sort of short-lived small organizations can make this art scene in Edmonton more dynamic in the way that they evolve and create opportunities, but like you were saying, it closes but then opens in a different way? Or
Well, we're so tight-knit here that people don't really go, like, unless you move away, you don't really go away. And even if you move away, people are still sort of here and they come back. So no one's gonna forget that like me and Chelsea are like still around. Like we're both still involved in the community, and we're more involved in the community now because of the drawing room, for sure. For sure.
Thanks so much for talking to us. This is great.
Yeah, thank you. That was fun.
Thanks for inviting me.
I loved your official notes, Riva.
I can't know myself. I'm a historical training. Writer.
Yeah.